What's up, guys? So, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you've heard from multiple sources that this league has been the worst league ever as far as player retention goes. In fact, the numbers are so low that PoEDB can't even track the player count, which is crazy. I had gone back and forth whether or not to make this video about this topic for a couple of different reasons. One is that there's been a lot of other big content creators that have made similar videos about this, and given my experience with videos of this type, they typically aren't very well received by my audience. But I ultimately decided to make this video, but more so from the perspective of someone who wanted to keep playing the league, but ended up quitting just because of everyone else leaving. So without further ado, we'll go into the problems with the league and then why I ultimately ended up quitting the league. So let's jump into it. In my opinion, the TLDR of what happened with this league is that GGG just tried to do too much in one league. They made massive changes to the base game and also had a very convoluted and complex two-part league mechanic. I think had they decided to make very minor changes to the base game and ran with Necropolis how it is, minus all the bugs and exploits, I think it probably would have went over pretty well. Trial of the Ancestors, I think, was probably one of the worst league mechanics. I personally barely interacted with it. Sorry for those of you guys that enjoyed it. I hated it, and I think a lot of people would agree with me. But the player retention was still pretty good because the base game was solid. Anyone who's ever taken a science class knows that you don't introduce multiple variables when you're trying to test something out. And that's exactly what I think this league was, a test for PoE 2. With the ridiculous amount of game-breaking bugs this league had, there is no way I believe that this wasn't tested. Or at the very least, it was barely tested. You don't get a bug where you can 6-link a non-6-linkable item if any sort of game testing was done on the mechanic. Because of these game-breaking bugs and exploits, hotfixes were issued, but not before some of the grindiest of grinders were able to take advantage of these. This would lead to players flooding the market with normally expensive items, i.e. Headhunter, Mage Blood, and Calandra's Touch, along with many others. This caused a lot of players to quit the league due to FOMO, and this trend would continue of broken things being discovered and then being shortly nerfed or removed. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer, so to speak. I watched the full reveal stream on Twitch, and the general feeling of everyone in the chat was that of excitement. All of my friends I talked to seemed to be stoked about the league. There was some obvious grumbling over the removal of instant skills bound to left mouse, but for the most part, everyone was pretty positive. This positive outlook would quickly turn sour for most players as bug after bug and exploit after exploit was discovered. Just take a look at some of these comments on the forums. This is just one thread, mind you. All of the hotfixes pretty much have very similar comments just like this. I'm not going to go into all the bugs as there was a ton of them, but I will hit on the big/important ones. The first big bug that was discovered was the new Scarab, Domination Scarab of Teachings. Domination Scarab of Teachings, in case you didn't know, increases the amount of experience gained per active shrine buff. Sounds pretty balanced on paper, right? Well, the problem is it didn't take into account the all-flame effect of monsters drop lesser shrine on death, or the Gull Helm trigger level 1 create lesser shrine when you kill an enemy. This resulted in a massive experience gain where players were shooting up to level 100 way quicker than they normally would have been able to. The next big thing that would completely warp the economy and cause a lot of players to quit was an interaction between the All-Flame Ember of Frogs and the All-Flame Ember of Rats. There were devoted modifiers that gave a chance to drop additional divine orbs at 3, 4, and 5%. Players would do what's called divine fishing, where they would keep rolling maps until they saw this devoted modifier. Then they would apply either an all-flame ember of frogs or an all-flame ember of rats, and the increased pack size would get anywhere from 20 to 100 divines dropping in a single map. A similar strat was used with the all-flame ember of meat sacks, which has a huge quantity and rarity modifier. They would fish for a modifier that increased quantity and rarity of the strongest monster in the pack, and then apply the meat sack ember, causing every one of those packs to drop a ton of T0 uniques. The next huge game-breaking bug was probably one of the biggest bugs I've ever seen in PoE, and that was involving beast crafting. There was a new beast craft that guaranteed the maximum amount of sockets on an item. The problem is this craft ignored how many sockets an item could have, and even ignored if an item could even have sockets. This resulted in 6-link squires, KM hearts with 6 sockets, etc. This was swiftly patched and removed, but not before players spent and made a lot of money from this exploit. Ideally, these sort of game breaking or game warping things would never even be implemented into the league. I don't think much of these new mechanics were tested, or at the very least were not tested much. Just look at all these hotfixes. I'm not really sure what the solution is here other than just not letting these bugs or exploits into the game in the first place. I would argue that more players quit the league because of the OP strat being nerfed after it was already abused than players who quit just because of the OP strat existing. Obviously, bugs like Einer kills everything in T17 exploits or the 6-link anything exploit couldn't exist, but I think some of the other exploits could have just been toned down and the economy would eventually stabilize. By immediately removing these broken things, I think it made an already bad problem worse and caused a huge exodus of players. Necropolis introduced a massive overhaul to Scarabs. Initially, this change was viewed as being extremely positive. Once players got a few days into the league and started interacting with the Scarabs, they realized that there were some massive downsides to the rework. With sextants being removed, a lot of the power needed to juice your maps was reallocated to the Scarabs. Because of this, you were forced to run at least 2 or sometimes all 4 slots just to make the map even worth running. The problem with this is players are being pigeonholed into running really only one mechanic, whereas in past leagues you could run multiple mechanics that were mostly profitable. Initially, this was marketed as being able to double down on your chosen lead mechanic if you chose to, not you have to double down in order to make the mechanic even worth it. On top of this, the more rare Scarabs were so rare and or expensive that they were basically only reserved for group play. I think some of these Scarabs should be combined so that they are not taking up a slot just to add the mechanic to your map. For example, combine the Bestiary Scarab with the Bestiary Scarab of the Horde, or combine Delirium Scarab with the Delirium Scarab of Delusions. I think ideally having only 3 Scarabs per mechanic would be great, and then the 4th Scarab could be used to juice the content that you're running, and you could add maybe something like a Horn Scarab of Bloodlines, or Horn Scarab of Awakening, or even a Sacrifice Fragment, something like that. The problem as it stands now is there's just too many Scarabs and there aren't enough slots in your map device. I'm not going to go into grave crafting as a whole because that could be an entire video on its own. I'm just going to touch on the corpses and the frustration with either trying to grave craft yourself or selling the corpses that you collected. Corpses have a similar problem that Scarabs have, is that there's just simply too many of them. On League launch, you couldn't even itemize these in your map, which would force you to periodically visit the Necropolis and itemize the ones that were worth selling and burn the ones that weren't. The major problem with this is that you can only store 64 corpses, while a full grave craft requires 88 corpses. This forced players to have massive inventory tabs of corpses because they do not stack for some reason. I understand the reason the corpses don't stack is because there are various monster types that are associated with the different corpses, causing them to technically be classified as different items, even though they produce the same effect. But this begs the question, why do they even have different monster types in the first place? Selling corpses was also extremely frustrating and tedious, as most times the corpse or corpses that someone wanted to buy would not highlight in your stash. This would cause you to have to highlight their chat message and then search your inventory for the corpse that they wanted. I eventually gave up and only sold the really expensive corpses because it just simply wasn't worth the time to try to sort and figure out which corpse someone actually wanted to buy. T17s were another thing that was announced in Necropolis League that players were pretty excited about. T17s were initially marketed as being a gateway or stepping stone to Uber bosses. The problem is that T17s are just objectively harder than Uber bosses. With map mods that will brick literally any build, it's wild that on release you couldn't even modify these maps. This was eventually changed as you can modify T17s now with Chaos Orbs, but with so many unplayable mods for most builds, players were forced to spend a lot of time and a lot of Chaos Orbs rerolling maps to make them runnable. And even if you rolled the map to all mods you could run, the Lantern of Aramor could add mods to the monsters that would brick your map. With how low the drop chance of T17s is, it's expensive to buy the maps yourself and time consuming to farm the maps. So even if you farmed up or bought a bunch of T17s to run, your map could be ruined by an unskippable lead mechanic costing you at least a half a div on the map itself and probably another 1 to 2 divs in Scarabs. I understand that they needed to make T17s hard so that Magic Find builds couldn't just blast through the hardest content in the game and just print currency, but this was not the way to do it. I personally think that Magic Find should just be removed from the game entirely, but that's a subject for another video. Despite all these problems with the league, I was, for the most part, still pretty much enjoying myself. I had made my own build that was really good, and I was enjoying playing something that I had created when I normally just follow someone else's guide. There are a few things that culminated to make me finally give up on this league and start working on getting my character ready for the Elden Ring DLC. The first thing was everyone leaving. There are a lot of things that happen, especially in a trade league when a bunch of players leave. First of all, items become harder to sell. Things that would normally fly off the shelves in a normal league state sit and rot in your stash. Items also become harder and more expensive to buy. One of the few upsides to this league, at least for me, was that I was forced to learn how to craft, as a lot of the items I needed simply were just not available for sale, or if they were, the person hadn't logged on in a month. Items that are constantly used in any league also spike in price, as there are a lot less players playing, less players farming those items, and there is still a demand, so prices go up. The final nail in the coffin for me this league, pun intended, was having my Animate Guardian randomly die in a T17 that had no mods I couldn't run and no lantern effects that would brick my build or my minions. Losing an AG is frustrating in its own right, but the thing that made me throw up my hands was that I couldn't find a pair of Grapevines that had the corrupted implicit that I wanted. There were a ton of them available for sale, but the problem was all those players hadn't logged on in weeks. After buying about 100 pairs of Grapevines and trying to corrupt them myself, I ultimately gave up and decided to just wait for the next league. It's really a shame that this is how this league panned out, as I think if this league had been executed properly, it could have been amazing. There were so many economy warping and game-breaking bugs/exploits this league that I think the only logical conclusion is that GGG is focusing the majority of its efforts on PoE 2, leaving PoE 1 largely neglected. There are a lot of really good ideas on paper that I think just weren't tested enough. I really hope they do better next league. With the announcement that this league and all future leagues until PoE 2 comes out will be 4 months, I don't know if I can handle another botched league. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, as it does really help with the YouTube algorithm. I make weekly content with a strong emphasis on PoE, but I will also do various other gaming topics. Until next time, have a great day/night. See ya.